and I think we're running on both of these. And so, just to introduce the tape of we're here talking with Bob Loudan about writing and retirement and people in Southeast who do it. Bob's one who's, I think, done quite a lot. As I see it, your most recent publication is a history of the dramatic symphony that you published about a year ago. Is that right, Bob?
Yes, in July.
What was that? And can you just give a little description of that?
Yes, years ago when I was in Paris, I did a lot of research in the National Library of France, which is an extraordinary institution founded in 1305 and has, if you can recognize the size of Wilson Library and consider that 2 levels down, that would be just the index to the library. So it becomes a major source. And I was particularly interested in realism in music and how it could best be attacked and what would happen if you went one direction or the other. And I was also interested in the fact of realism in painting as well. So I went out to some of the homes of the famous painters at the time as well. This was really quite a tussle for me because my French was quite imperfect and remains so today, but I managed fairly well. And it was fun to try this out and see connections between painting and actual music. And we found lots of connections, and I've kept up that interest. And so this latest publication on the dramatic symphony takes the time between about 1839 going up into the early 1850s. And the so-called dramatic symphony was one in which the music played a major part, but at the same time, drama began to be immersed into the music itself. So if nothing else, you had a narrator who would narrate the story as the music was being presented. Or if not a narrator, you might have a small chorus that was doing the same thing, expanding on the themes of this dramatic idea. And so things like the story of Romeo and Juliet would be proposed as a topic, and Berlioz wrote a magnificent symphony on this, in which he has a small chorus that tells the story, and then the orchestra takes over and depicts the love scene in a purely musical way, or the scene of the sylphs and the dancing characters also in a way. And that became a matter of contention because some people thought that music should not be corrupted by dramatic elements, and others felt that it was real enhancement of the music itself. So it became a difficult matter of contention, and by the mid-century, it was difficult for people to accept this new version. And they claimed that it was corrupting music. So we got 2 forces. We got one that was delving purely into music, and one that was delving into music plus drama. And those became the matter of contention then. And by mid-century, it was so fixed in people's mind that music should be pure or music should be dramatic, that a real quarrel arose. And so we got people very fond of Wagner, but some people hated him. So we got 2 sides doing things. a really difficult matter. And this idea of the dramatic symphony was one which had a narrator or some type of choral force that gave it a thread of drama. And for instance, the most famous of these was what was called an ode symphony. And it had several portions to it. At the beginning would be very, very low notes, as if it were coming out of the depths of some unknown place. And gradually those low notes would expand and come out into an expansion of a caravan, a desert caravan, making its way through the desert, and barely out, but when a sandstorm erupts, and the whole thing is enveloped in troubles and corruption, and the feeling of the religious aspect became a difficult matter too, because it was the time of typically an immersion into northern Africa, and you began to get the idea that you should be pure in your approach to the Moorish element and this type of thing, to the fact that some people speculated that the bell towers of Paris would be changed completely, and minarets would take their place.
Well, that shows how far people can speculate. One of the other things that I wanted to talk about today is poetry, and I know you've been writing poetry for a long time. And are you still working on anything these days or not?
Oh yes. One doesn't give up what one loves. Okay. Incidentally, I began at age 3 when my mother made up little tiny books for me of Peter Rabbit and things of this sort. And for a long time I gave that up because I was dealing with music history and very concentrated ideas, but I've come back to that and enjoy it immensely.
Has most of your poetry been written in retirement then?
Yes, most of it.
I have, I'd like to ask you to read a couple of poems. I brought a copy of your book, Among the Displaced, which I think is a lovely chapbook of poetry. And it's written about your experiences in World War II.
Yes.
The first poem that I'd like you to read, if you would, which I think sort of is a way of introducing it, is Inducted. Do you think you could read that for us?
Well, I can try. Yes, when you're inducted into the Army, it's an experience all to its own. So they typically have some older man who roams the camp and tries to be kind of like a good, friendly uncle to all of these raw recruits. I tried giving something of this by reversing the usual poetry and putting the rhyme at the beginning of the line rather than at the end of the line. And this is the way it goes. Fastidious in dress, fastidious demeanor, formal in his words, formal in his manners, wary of the outre. Wandering in barracks, wandering the courtyard, wondering at the tumult, and wondering withdrawn, fearful of the outcome. Swearing his allegiance, swearing all unknowing, savoring the chatter, savoring the cussing, down the social ladder. Measured for his shoes, measured for his eyesight, mobilized for duty, mobilized at gunpoint in articles of war. Promised to the nation, promised up to death, pounded by the chaos, pummeled by the press of men upon a mission, and stripped of face and name, and stripped of undergarments, alone among his fellows, alone with peering doctors, nude, an army number.
Thank you. I think that that's an experience that is less well known today, where, in my generation, the draft ended, more or less. It's there theoretically. But certainly, I think an experience that's something we should all remember. Something, because I fear my own fear is that the country is people have lost their sense that they owe anything. And the experience of people who had to be promised unto death, I think, is something we should all remember. So you ended up going to England, right?
Yes.
And what kind